if laws were going to be about legislating the common good or making sure that like that could happen and limiting vice and increasing virtue, then we have to kind of all agree about what the good is.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what are good things? And what are good things that we want to make available to everyone, and how do we get there? And that's why education was so important, because in order for the polity, the citizens, to rule and be ruled, but to do that wisely and oriented towards true and good and beautiful things, they had to first know what those things were.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome to Classical Etc. You're in the studio with Memoria Press.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Classical Etc. I'm Jessica Aboud, and I am here with Paul Schaefer, Mr. Mitchell Hawley, regular guest at this point, headmaster of our online academy.
Maybe favorite guest?
Hall of Fun, yes, Hall of Fun. And Mr. Dustin Warren. We are so glad to have you back after our recent trivia episode on American history.
I appreciate it. I'm just like, I got invited back. I guess that wasn't horrible.
Not at all.
So, yeah.
The views went through the roof, is what I've heard. The people say. I don't know.
Yes.
They
Dustin,
love me.
You teach our history classes here at Highlands Latin School in Louisville. You teach high school students all
many grades.
Many grades of history, and you're our resident expert.
Oh.
So
Okay.
yes. What are we reading, gentlemen? Paul, I'll start with you.
In order to try to get back on the reading train, I picked up Graham Greene's The Fallen Idol, about a boy caught up in the games adults play, is what they say on the back of the book. Only gotten a couple of chapters
Intriguing.
It's going to be great because it's Graham Greene, but it's short.
Okay.
And so that tells you how much time I've had to read. I'm looking forward to hunting season to go sit in a tree and read. And so that starts tomorrow. So maybe I'll come back with a whole bunch of stuff read. Or maybe I'll just sit there in silence. I haven't quite decided yet.
Just sit in the tree all day. Why is Paul out there all day?
He just needed some space.
A lot on his mind.
You know, just every once in a while, you just need to get away.
Yeah.
And hunting season is a great opportunity for me to do that.
Oh, yeah.
Dustin, how about you?
I'm bouncing. I tried to pick up, there's a couple books I haven't finished. I'm halfway through on Soul and Resurrection by Gregory of Nyssa, which is about
the soul and resurrection.
Yeah. I was like trying to think, how can I summarize it really quick? I was like, I'll just repeat the title. It's a little trippy, but it's an interesting read though.
Never had somebody refer to Gregory of Nyssa as trippy, but okay.
Gregory of Nyssa is a little trippy.
Yeah, he's ambitious. I'm trying to resist making. I
He is a
have
church
like three
father.
jokes in my
You
head.
better respect him.
I do. I read him, therefore I respect him.
Yeah.
But I really enjoy a lot of the early church fathers, particularly like the Cappadocians. So I haven't read much of Gregory. Well, that Gregory though. So halfway through that, just got to do the part about purgation, but I will leave that controversial topic alone.
Period.
And I'm about done with, almost done with the Brandon Sanderson. It's a bit more of a pop fantasy series, the Stormlight Archive series. I'm on like the third book, Oathbringer, I think is the third book. So I'm almost done with that. Those are massive. They're like 1,000 pages each.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
They were super popular.
He's kind of like, it's like a kind of a neo Tolkien a little bit in some ways. So I won't spoil anything about it, but it's very religious too in some ways, but also a little bit of Gnosticism brought in. So just anything ancient, right or wrong, is fun to read about.
And he also does a really good job of like bringing other people into like helping him like with his writing projects.
Yeah, he's really
he writes
public.
a lot of books with other people.
He does, yeah. And he teaches classes about it, and then he also like even publishes like he has like I think like a group of people of his readers. Like he sends out like early drafts, like, hey, what do you think? He takes feedback. So
yeah, I've wanted to read
he's
some
a
of his books. I'm just
machine.
not into like the fantasy.
Yeah.
But I think if you were to, would you say that if you were going to get into it, like he's like a good author to start with?
I think so. Yeah, if you like start with a more modern author, yeah.
We can assume you're not reading fantasy of any subgenre.
No, I'm still wrapping up the Le Carré novels, but then the spy novel that I just picked up is actually Escoffier, that cookbook that I
love it.
That I got you.
Yes, yeah. It's beautiful.
It's like a 1900s French cookbook. It was like one of the first sort of books. It's not really a cookbook. It's more like it's like a guide to French cooking. And so it starts off with the foundation of French cooking, which is the sauces, and then sort of how you prepare the vegetables and meats. And
Now,
all
are you just like reading this cover to cover?
Yes.
It's really readable, and it's exciting to read if you like to cook, because it's not like the cookbooks of today. There's so many assumptions about the skills you have, the information that you've already acquired. So when it tells you how to cook a certain type of Brussels sprout, it's assuming you're coming into that little paragraph with so much information.
Having like read the whole thing up until that point.
It's really fun to read.
No
Mitchell got it for me. He drew me in the book exchange last Christmas, and I read big parts of it over last Christmas break. It was really fun to read.
Yeah, I'm really looking for. I just finished sauces, so and I took some notes. I'm hopeful to go back and practice some of the sauces. I've never made some of them. There's way more than I do.
If you'd like to make a sauce for some venison this season, maybe,
that's a huge. We're coming up to hunting season, and so I pulled this out, and I've had it on my shelf for a while. My mom really loved it growing up. She used it a lot, and so I was like, you know what? I need to vamp up my ability to prepare meat items for my family, because I feel like I love meat, but I always struggle in the execution. You know, I think I can grill whatever. Of course, I'm a man. I can grill, but other more complicated or nuanced preparations are. Yeah. So anyway,
all right. Well, invite me over.
Yeah, let's do it.
Sauce does cover a multitude of sins.
Sauces.
It does.
It's like ranch.
Yeah. Just pair anything in ranch or whatever makes it better.
Oh.
Well,
that's what I'm learning with this cookbook. No,
that's right. The French knew it first.
The French, yeah, ranch. Wow.
Oh well, quite a pivot we're about to make, but into the topic. We are recording this in the fall. We've just gone through quite an election season here in the U.S., so we thought it would be fun, understatement, we thought it would be fun to talk about, with our two history experts, how the great minds...
I don't know how Mitchell got to be a history expert.
I'm an expert.
Remember, you have your own expertise, Paul, maybe just not.
Wow. Okay. All right. I'm just going to sit over here.
You're an expert to me. I got you.
Thanks, Dustin.
You're welcome.
Actually, I would rather not be called an expert. I would just rather be called a knowledgeable person about history.
We've got our experts and our knowledgeable people here today. Thankful for each of them, what they bring. And we are going to look at how the great minds in classical history have thought about civics and engaging with politics in your community throughout history. So big topic.
With absolutely no reference to what's going on today. Just starting in the ancients.
That's right.
Yeah. That's what I think about being in classical education is you could, it's like, we're going to talk about politics, but 800 years ago.
Yeah.
Or more. And before we get into some of the individuals and what they thought, what they wrote, this is a question for everybody. How are we defining civic engagement? Are we thinking big picture, local community, just so we're all on the same page with what we're talking about?
The Greeks have a word for this.
What is it?
Politeamai, which means to live as a citizen or to engage in the duties of a citizen. And politeamai, you hear that first word, it comes from the word polis. Mm-hmm. Polis is the word for like a city-state. So you have polis, which is the city-state. You have a polites, which is a citizen who lives in the city-state. And then there's a question of, okay, you got a citizen, you've got a city-state. What governs their life together? Well, a politeia. That's the constitution, that's sort of the logic that governs their life today. And then someone who engages in the polis under the guidance of the politeia as a polites, as a citizen, is someone who is engaging in politeamai, which is to live as a citizen. And so when I think about civic engagement, I'm thinking about the verb. It is, what do we mean when we say to live as a citizen or to engage in political life?
To be a little simpler.
A little simpler.
Just a tad. I would like to point out that if we're taking our inspiration from ancient Greece and Rome, we have to think about particularly ancient Greece, and we have to compare that to our current day, as those are really like villages or towns compared to our megatropolises that we have today.
Mm-hmm.
And so when Plato talks about like a philosopher king,
a mayor.
It's like a mayor, and so I think that is an important sort of distinction of what, when we talking about local communities, we're talking about big picture, like the idea of a federal government that's over hundreds of millions of people is really just, I think, would boggle the minds of the ancients.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and that happened. I mean, with Alexander the Great, whenever he really established some of the first cosmopolises, like cosmos meaning the world, and a polis meaning a city, the sort of a world city.
Mm-hmm.
The word cosmopolis sort of he sort of actually named some cities cosmopolis, and they were incredibly hard to run because of the pluralism that is sort of central to those large mega cities.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You have groups of people that are very different in upbringing, very different, and sort of values and what they want to do in the world and what they consider good and evil, and they're just trying to work it out in a big city. And so that problem that you see you rightly point to like the difficulty of like going back to Plato and Aristotle and say we should just like take everything they said, because they're really defining like Shelbyville, they're not really like looking at Louisville, because they making the assumption that everyone really kind of agrees on what the good is, and are sort of moving the same direction, and that it's hard to describe most American cities, even small American cities today, in that sort of
as a polis.
Yeah. Right.
Interesting. Did they have a common view on like the balance between maybe personal freedom and then a duty to the needs of your community or your state?
That's the beautiful thing about Athens and Sparta, right? Mm-hmm. Because Sparta's like, no individual freedom. We force you to do what we say, but then we're going to be powerful.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Whereas Athens is like, no, like this isn't, you're right. The classical era, right? Before Athens turns into a colonial driven aristocracy.
Right.
But Athens was like, no, like the common man can come in and maybe not, maybe we went too far.
Yeah.
But the regular person can have a voice in what we decide to do as a polis, right? Whereas in Sparta, you had one, was Lycurgus king? I mean, he was, I mean, he was king. And so that was defining these things. And so you kind of see the struggle between them. And the beauty of it was that when the two ended up fighting each other, it was actually Athens was able to better mobilize its entire. Everybody was willing to get into it, and they were able to weather the storm against Sparta.
Mm-hmm.
I think because you had that buy-in. Now that whole fight then ended because you need a strong leader in those times. Ended up turning Athens into an aristocracy,
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And so there's definitely different sides of that coin in ancient Greece.
Well, Solon, whenever he came in, so you've heard of like draconian laws, and they're usually that's like laws that really oppress people. So Draco is a to speak Greek, which we all should, is a he had this constitution, this series of laws, these draconian revolutions that really oppressed the people of Athens, and that was partly Sparta's fault. But then Solon came along and said, well, we're going to alleviate all debts, because if you don't have any debts, you can be a citizen. And to be a citizen, you are under the obligation to fight in the army. So only citizens fought in the army. Slaves didn't fight in the army. And so if you owed a debt to someone and you were going to go into sort of like servitude or service, you could not fight in the army. So how do you grow
and also
your
you couldn't be a citizen at that point.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
You can't be a citizen. And so how do you grow your army?
You forgive debts.
You forgive all your debts. Yeah, that's how you forgive your army. So, Sparta came in and sort of instituted these draconian reforms, and what that did is it paralyzed the city-state. And so it's funny that Solon came in and sort of liberated all the debts, just not totally to like grow the army, but that was byproduct.
A wonderful byproduct for him.
Yeah, a wonderful byproduct. But going back to that question of sort of personal liberty, and sort of like service to the state, I think it's helpful to remember that in America, we kind of define citizenship as a series of rights that we have.
Mm-hmm.
But in Greece, and this is true to a large degree for Rome as well, citizenship was not defined as rights, really. It was as obligations. And really for Greece, it was 4 obligations. It was the obligation to fight in the army, to own land, to vote and participate in the polis, and one more that I can't remember.
I'm not going to be able to help you there, but I do know that the Romans, if you're a Roman citizen, you at least had the right to be beheaded instead of crucified.
Yes.
And so there were perks. There were,
perks,
but I think to Mitchell's point, the ancients really largely thought about this with regards to duty. You get some rights and some perks, but largely it's the duty you owe to the state.
Yeah.
And today we often think about, what do I get? Big old JFK just stare me in the face. I don't know if you want to pipe in here.
That's not what you can do.
What the country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. I mean,
get it right. Yeah.
He was really coming at it from, in some ways, a very ancient perspective of this is an obligation, right? As a citizen, you need to say, what can I do for my country?
The Americans kind of lean more towards, not in totality, because like civic education started dropping really in the 60s for a multitude of reasons. I'm sure partly Vietnam wasn't helpful, and everything else happened afterwards. It was a very tense time. But yeah, like we've often focused more on the individualistic aspect rather than the communal, in a sense.
Yeah. And the idea of the good, right? The common good. And I think, I don't know who said, you, Jess or Mitchell, you said, but like this idea of the polis having fairly, like a fairly defined, everybody agreed on what that common good was largely. And if we don't have that foundation, it's really hard to decide, to agree on what are we going to do.
Yeah, and it goes back to like freedom. Do you have the freedom to do anything that you want? Is that really freedom? Is freedom the freedom to do anything you want? Or is freedom should it be mainly conceived of as a freedom towards something? And the Greeks and Christians say that freedom is not a freedom of, is a total freedom of choice. It's not license. Freedom is not license. It's a freedom to service to God, or for the Greeks, it was freedom to fight in the army, to vote, to participate, to rule and be ruled, and to own land, right? And that's why, like, there's this famous court case in ancient Athens where a corn farmer, during a time of war, is selling corn to another city-state. And as a result of that, he's taking away food and coin from his own city-state. And so he's tried and killed. Maybe an interesting question that would be worth discussing, because this is kind of related to this question of the rights of the state versus the rights of the individual. Like, when you make choices, should the state sort of prevail and the needs of the state prevail versus and in Athens, it was definitely like the needs of the state. And that's because, again, the needs of the state was a lot more representative of the needs of the people, because it's a smaller group of people, like just, at certain points in history, it was only a few hundred people, honestly.
Right. And the existence of the state was more tenuous too.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So in America, we have really parsed these out. We've got a Bill of Rights, right? We have the right to freedom of speech,
own property,
etc. What guarantees those rights? What do you think? This is a good philosophical question. Like, who says like, oh, you have those rights?
Depends on who you ask. In some ways.
Like, are those given to you by God, or did we as a society just sort of say
social contract, basically?
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Did we just sort of say as a society that, it's good that we build a society that everyone gets to say what they want,
right? And the whole push and thought and development of human dignity.
Yeah.
So what we're trying to do as a society is, instead of rooting those rights coming from our participation in the image and likeness of God, rather those rights come from just the very fact that we're human and therefore we have this dignity.
Right.
And so we've severed that link. But there is an attempt to try to root that just in the nature of being human.
Yeah.
Which is funny, because most of society doesn't admit the existence of natures, but
right.
But when it comes to humans, we kind of want to
maintain that a little bit,
in order to maintain those Bill of Rights. Otherwise, it's purely social contract,
right?
Which means that then, as soon as 51% of the population doesn't want
agree
me to have property rights, they can just take it away because it's not actually it's not a right founded in the fibers of the universe. It's a right founded in just disagreement we have as humans.
Yeah. Well, that's a good like contrast, because I think there's a political tradition today that would sort of root those rights in a social contract, and then there's a sort of more like Aristotelian sort of medieval grounding, which is, well, there's something about being like the dignity of being a person. Like if we're going to treat every person like a person, then we don't take their things. And we actually, God said that. That's one way you treat a person as a qua person, instead of as like a means to your own, gratification or whatever. But then you get some tricky rights in there in the Bill of Rights if you try to ground all of those, because can all of those be grounded in nature themselves? We can almost go through the Bill of Rights and sort of try to parse those out, because some of them deterred, and actually we went back and we had to say, some of these we had to revise some of these, right? But we as Americans, we are like very keen to sort of say, well, we have a right to liberty, life, pursuit of happiness, etc.
In a more individualistic way.
Right. Whereas I think in the classical world, you would never frame your own happiness as against everyone else's happiness.
Which I would add for Jefferson, to give him a little, not that you're attacking him, like when he says pursuit of happiness, like he's thinking of like Aristotle and others, that with citizenship and civic engagement, like education, yes, is for the mind and to build yourself up, but also part of the education, becoming a whole person is, and for society to flourish, for you to flourish, is being a good citizen. So like you participate in society, you serve in all the ways you might serve, military, voting, charity. Well, the Greeks had interesting views on charity, but we'll leave that alone. Like that is a way in which you become a whole person. So you flourish, society flourishes. So like Jefferson's thinking, yes, like oftentimes Americans take it individualistically. He's thinking too, pursuit of happiness is not just your happiness, but all people's happiness. Because what you do for society will be also good for you. And that will build those, as Lincoln says, those bonds of affection.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's a very good point, that I think the founding fathers being steeped in this ancient thought.
Yeah. Because they're thinking about those things.
They're thinking about common good.
Yeah.
Like, what is the common good? And they're basically saying, for our society, this is why we were revolted from King George, was because the best good for our society, in looking at it more from a polis perspective, is not to be ruled by somebody who doesn't know what we actually need.
Yeah.
Right. And I think they expected, farmers and lawyers and everybody just to say, somebody needs to lead our society. I'm going to step up and I'm going to do this. Right. And not because it was going to benefit that person, but because it was for the common good. It was for the community.
And would benefit you eventually too, right? As well.
Right. Because the community would be healthier. Yes. But not in an individualistic sense. It's not that I get to get into power so that I know whatever it could be. I know, we're going to make this policy change and that's going to make certain stocks go up so I can go buy my stocks early, or, or, I can leverage this to get an exemption for this other thing I want to go do over here. Like that's not what they perceived as it being also for their own good, right? Yeah. It's a good through the common good.
Yeah. Well, and it goes back to the question of, an interesting question just to follow up is to build on what you're saying is, how big is your personal polis today? So
that's the problem with democracy. Yeah,
that's the problem with democracy is that really our polis is too big, and actually and so what I mean by that is that if we're going to say that citizenship means that it's this balance between the rights that you have and the obligations that you owe to everyone else in your polis, then you have to be really careful about how you define who's in your polis. And this is the problem the Greeks had all the time, and that's why they perpetually started limiting citizenship to just like a few people, so that by the end, like right before Alexander the Great came over, it was just the joke was like, there's only 10 people in the assembly who are voting, because they kept getting very, very restrictive about who could actually be a citizen. But that's a really good question, because if you are going to define it as an obligation that you owe and a sort of the mutual pursuit of good that we are going to have I'm going to rule you and you're going to rule me, and we're going to rule to the benefit of each other, which is the democratic model, which is the Athenian model. then you really want to make sure that the person you let in your polis sort of shares a sort of so, you know, in a modern sense, how big is your polis? You know, can you say that at the country level, can you really negotiate in your own life the obligations that you owe to everyone in the country? And what I like about, and this is what we like learn from like the Catholic Middle Ages, is that principle of subsidiarity, where like I think we would all say that like our families are like pretty communist. We in the
Say more.
like
That's defensible.
You owe absolute. You owe everything to your wife and to your kids, and your kids don't really produce anything other than a few smiles and chuckles, and you are producing everything for them, and you owe it to your kids, to the things that are yours. The Greeks would say the things that are in your hands. You owe to them everything, and then one step outside of that, okay, like your neighbors. Do I owe to provide to my neighbors all of their meals? No, but would I provide some meals for them if they were sick? You know, probably. Like if I lived in a smaller community, would I even would I give them a key to my house and take care of their house when they were gone? You know, if they had farm animals, Paul, like you and your neighbors are like always calling each other, your animals are, you're like sort of all taking care of each other's animals, right? And you feel like you owe a debt to them because they're in your hands. They're your neighbors. But then one step further, like Louisville, do I owe a debt? What kind of obligation do I owe? So like the further out you go in that those spheres, the less obligation you owe to them, right? I mean, because you can't, you're just one person, right? You can't give the same level of care to everyone that you give your family.
And if everybody was obligated to Louisville in the same way, well, Louisville's government would have to be massive because we would need a spot in everybody for that government in order to for everybody to be able to participate that way. Right. But in fact, we've embraced a form of a republic that says we can't all engage with it. We need to select a few people that are then going to go engage with it. Right. But that's an important, even that selecting of who's going to go engage with it is an important thing.
Right. So they become like the microcosm of the macrocosm, right? You have all these representatives from all over trying to represent their constituencies. Yeah. That's I was trying to think of the fancy word. And they come together to try to voice those things, right?
Sometimes though, the Republic model, not to push back too hard, but sometimes the Republic model means that the citizens get to be lazy. That they don't have to engage in the rule and being ruled. And as a result, maybe they even lose touch in the pulse of like what's true and what's good. And that's why like I really do love idolizing the Athenian democracy for all of its flaws. But, you know, it is helpful to realize that it's really not possible today. I mean, some of those values that are possible at the Athenian level are possible like in my family and like in a polis sense, but my polis just can't be all of Louisville, right?
But you know what's interesting about that is there's a definite window in time where societies have gotten so large that it's impossible for them to be true democracies. But I feel like our technology is catching up to where if we wanted to say we're going to be 300 million people that are going to vote on every issue.
Oh, sure.
Or you have the option to vote on every issue as a citizen.
We're going to have so many apps.
We could have an app for that, right? And be like, oh, we're going to do that. Boom, done. You know?
And and then that gets into the, like, is pure democracy like a good thing?
Yeah, I think we would end up with way more mobs.
Yeah. Then ultimately, of course, Aristotle's right that pure democracy tends towards mob rule. Yeah. But yeah, like that classical ideal, it's really hard to live that out today. And the idea, the possibility that or just the reality that we live in a pluralistic society where we sort of have to all do life together, which is a very millennial thing to say. It makes governing challenging, and that's why like maybe the best of us should be leaders, not
everyone.
We're going to stop you there. We haven't gotten to, and I don't know how long we've got, but we haven't gotten to much about Rome or the Middle Ages.
Those are just footnotes to Greek
Hang
history.
on, no, they're not, because Cicero's got a great work on it's the Proarchia, the in defense of Archias, who is a Greek poet who is basically Cicero's defending him in court to say, no, Archias is actually a Roman citizen. Now, we can't prove that because the town that gave him honorary Roman citizenship, their records house burned down. And so we have no way to prove this. However, here's all the reasons he ought to be a citizen. Mm-hmm. And it's a very interesting look at the way the Romans viewed citizenship, and in the midst of this, for people listening to this that are in the classical education world, it is a defense of the liberal arts as well. He's saying, look, don't we want to be an educated people? If we want to be an educated people, we should bring in educators and make them citizens.
Yeah. That was actually one of my questions, is what role did education play? And to what extent did they see that as formation in a healthy republic that they were governing?
Well, it's an easier question, I think, in the Greeks than it is in the Romans, because Plato very clearly made the case that because of the desire for the common good, it is actually the society's role and the government's role to then take the children from the families to educate them in a way that's going to provide for the common good.
Yeah.
And I think any modern person that reads that goes, I don't like that idea.
But they do practice that. A lot
of them do practice that. And so for Plato, education was 100% about preparing philosopher kings. So people that could lead, that had been trained in wisdom and could make good decisions for the common good.
Yeah. And if laws were going to be about legislating the common good or making sure that that could happen and limiting vice and increasing virtue, then we have to kind of all agree about what the good is. Like, what are good things? And what are good things that we want to make available to everyone, and how do we get there? And that's why education was so important, because in order for the polity, the citizens, to rule and be ruled, but to do that wisely and oriented towards true and good and beautiful things, they had to first know what those things were. And that's why Aristotle makes the case that politicians must have a certain level of education. They don't need the education of a philosopher, but they need to be educated on the ethics, on what's good, so that as they're creating laws, they can do so in a virtuous way, right? And they can actually orient society towards that, because social engineering is a thing. As soon as we give tax breaks for people to have kids, then it encourages people to have kids. So the laws that we make do encourage certain behavior. And actually, we should have tax breaks for people to have kids, because kids are the foundation of society. I mean, they're the perpetuation of that society. So that is a good thing. So it's good. They would get tax breaks to people who have kids.
And they're not cheap.
I was going to say, and kids are expensive.
And kids are expensive, yeah.
But I also want to go back, Jess, you were asking about the role of education. Boethius in the 5th century AD is writing, so after the fall of Rome, but it's being run, Rome still exists. It's still being run by the Gothic kings, and the Senate still exists, and he's a part of the Senate, but he's been thrown in jail, and he's lamenting sort of this state that he's in, and he's talking to Lady Philosophy, his incarnate version of philosophy, and he goes, first of all, I'm only in this position because you as philosophy told me that it was a good thing, it was to serve the common good and get into politics. And he's like, and politics did this to me. So he's mad about that.
Politics made me do it.
No, but philosophy made him do it. Philosophy made him get into politics. And then he goes on to say, when he's bringing up these accusations that are against him, he says, and the very fact that I am trained in philosophy is proof enough to the people around me that I am engaged in evil doing, which I found a fascinating comment, because what philosophers are generally trained also in they have to be trained in logic, and they're also trained in rhetoric typically. And so they can, people that aren't trained in that become intimidated by that, and they think, well, you twist everything on its head, right? But even so, I mean, you're talking ancient Athens in the 500 BC all the way to 500 AD. The mentality still, at least in the leadership, and Boethius came from a political family. He had 2 emperors and a pope in his family. But he he's still thinking that because of his desire to serve the common good, he has to get into politics. And that's in Rome that has conquered all the known world at that point.
It's funny that politicians today still say that, right?
Yeah.
If someone asks like, hey, why are you running for president or any office? We don't have to talk about the presidency.
County judge executive.
Yeah, county judge executive. It's like, well, I want to serve our people, and I feel an obligation to like get in the race and make life better for everyone. They still say that.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's true anymore. Frankly, but they at least know enough to. They feel like they should say that. That should be the right reason.
Yeah.
Right. And what that really harkens back to is that classical idea of to rule and to be ruled, and to rule for a common good and to fight for that. Where I don't think that's not always true today in our modern politics, and people don't run necessarily for that reason anymore. Some people do. There's some notable exceptions, and they actually do things. But it's still funny that everyone feels the need to at least
pay lip service
to that idea, which is a very classical idea.
Very Machiavellian too.
Very Machiavellian. Yeah, it is very Machiavellian.
Hold on, draw that out for us, Dustin.
Well, Machiavelli's kind of the anti-Plato in some ways. Like his perspective, right, is appear to be good.
Right.
Pretend you care about the common good, but everyone is broken and evil on the inside, and they will stab you. So you stab them first, but look like you're going to be a nice guy.
Yeah,
but willing, cut them. That's kind of
but if it's Machiavelli
summarization.
Like every once in a while, you just
Yeah.
need to go up to someone on the street, to some like peasant or something, and just kill them.
Yeah, it's pragmatism. It's pure pragmatism.
Yeah, and that way everyone
Eliminate the threat.
No, it's not even a threat. Just like indiscriminately kill somebody, because everyone needs to know that like you can't be crossed, and you should rule with fear and sort of like, what's he gonna do next?
Better be feared than loved.
Better be feared than loved. That's right.
Yeah, inspired Michael Scott. So
classic. Yeah, talk about classical references.
Now
That's
I
all
need to go back and rewatch that whole series in the light of Machiavelli.
Oh, hilarious!
I just never liked the guy.
My little sister
Never liked him.
Machiavelli or Michael Scott?
Both.
That makes sense. I mean, Michael Scott's never. I cringe. I only could watch like 2
Yes.
episodes at a time because I would just die on the inside.
Yeah, and that's what Machiavelli does. That's why we cringe looking at politics.
Michael Scott, modern Machiavelli.
So I think we can establish in this conversation that Machiavelli is like maybe the last of the classical authors, political authors.
He's engaging with it, yeah.
And so he's engaged with it, but then also is like a really bad person. Like it's not good. So
Not
so like
a
when you say
leadership
like
book we're going to read.
yeah, like hey, Machiavellianism is like evil, right? So
Short-term affected, long-term
we would
bad.
all say that.
Yeah.
So hilariously, I'm sitting at a graduation for, I don't think it was my sister, it was for someone else at a public school. And someone gets up there and is giving this big grand oration, like about how awesome all these students did and all that, which is pretty typical of when students graduate, so pat on the back. And in order to sort of like pay homage to the classical tradition, he starts quoting Machiavelli. As if like, and the great Machiavelli said, and he was going on and on about how like these students were sort of like, like in their education, they were sort of embodying the Machiavellian principles of like leadership and governance. And the whole time my brother and I are just laughing hysterically. Cause like, here's a guy who went to the wiki page about Machiavelli or something. Cause he clearly, like anyone who's read The Prince knows that he's literally saying just indiscriminately kill people because it's politically expedient. And here he is, like in front of everyone.
Decontextualizing.
Yeah, how we quoted this. It was the equivalent of we quoted this old guy, and he says you're great. It was the wildest. It was the wildest thing. Education, everyone.
Yes,
read books.
But one book I would like to read that I have not read is the book that got the Parnassus Prize recently, Virtue Politics, about politics being driven by virtue in the Renaissance. Which I think I just want to bring that up in case somebody's looking for something to go read about this, because that's going to be highly inspired by the classical tradition, because that's what the whole Renaissance was. Let's bring back the classical tradition, and then. And I think I'm assuming part of the point there was Machiavelli wrote, yes, in that time period, but that's not the way they were acting at the time. And it took
And it is kind
centuries to seep in and then become our daily lives.
Yeah, it is kind of funny that Machiavelli is sort of remembered in that sort of like Italian city-state political movement, because he wrote this book, and he was trying to go around to like princes in all these city-states in Italy, trying to like convince them that they should like bring him on as an advisor. Like he was like kind of I think he was poor, right? Wasn't he poor?
Florence got taken over. He lost his job. He was a disgruntled former employee.
Yeah.
That's the best way to put it.
And wasn't he like going down there?
If
like
my boss was
princes?
merciless, I wouldn't be in this situation.
Yeah. But wasn't he trying to go to other princes and like sort of sell himself and like, hey, like I have a good book here and I've got some good ideas and my guy didn't listen to me. But
content creator.
It's a content creator. Yeah. Trying to peddle his stuff to other people. Yeah. It's so good.
Took a little while, but it caught on eventually.
Yeah.
Different ways, yeah.
What a good note to end on. And a good question to ponder.
It's not an easy one to answer.
No,
it isn't.
Politics is tough.
It isn't. It isn't.
Yeah. Education is important.
That's right. That's right. Even the principles and the virtues, or the virtues we're going to accept and the anti-virtues we're going to say, no, that can't come any further.
Right.
So, yeah, good conversation. Thanks for joining us, gentlemen.
That's fun. Dustin,
I think you're off to teach a class.
Yeah, I got a little bit of time, so I can at least go hydrate first.
Yeah,
hydrate or dihydrate.
What class do you have coming up today?
2 Europeans, and then medieval right after lunch. So hopping around.
Gotta stay awake.
Big day.
Gotta stay awake, yeah. Some of them are testing, so I'll just have to watch them be bored as they take their tests. Test days are nice and also boring. So anyway, it'll be good though.
Good deal.
Watch them suffer.
That's said like a true teacher.
Yeah, very Machiavellian of you.
You are what you read. I read them every year, sadly. Anyway.
Well, thanks for joining us, and thanks for joining us for another episode. We will see you next time. Thanks for joining us today on Classical Etc. by Memoria Press. If you like what you heard, please like, subscribe, or share this episode or comment. We love to hear your questions and your comments. If you want to learn more about Memoria Press, please go to memoriapress.com. This has been Classical Etc. We're so glad you joined us, and we'll see you next time.